It'll be just another about 30 seconds. I know it says that it's streaming, but it's actually still redirecting. Okay, Nancy, I've made you a co-host as well, so you can unmute yourself, and we are ready to start whenever you are.
Great. You can hear me?
Can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Welcome, folks. My name is Nancy Etter. I'm Regional Coordinator of Pax Christi Illinois. I want to welcome you to the 2021 Pax Christi Illinois Annual Gathering. We're happy to have all of you here in the audience and also all of you online. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have a brief prayer service. Johnny, if you put that halfway on or share that on the screen. Okay. All loving, wise, forgiving Father, Mother, Son, Spirit, God, help us surrender completely to you at this time of violence, deep sadness, profound suffering across the nation and world, especially among the poorest and most targeted communities. Make us effective instruments of your peace. Show us the way forward. Help all people assist each other exponentially with needed assets, food, medicine, shelters, and clothing in a most timely, effective way. Give us the wisdom and courage to always seek and speak the truth, to require the same from our leaders. The earth and its creatures also cry out for our loving care with the pandemic, the multitude of wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, melting glaciers, and rising seas. These disasters cannot wait for bureaucracy and slow-moving solutions. Help us, help each of us respond wholeheartedly. Do not let us wait, but take collective action now. In your wisdom, power, and strength, we dare not to believe in the law of the strongest, in the language of weapons, in the power of the powerful.
Within our darkest night, you kindle the fire that never dies away, never dies away. Within our darkest night.
We want to believe in the worth and dignity of all people, in the open hand and open heart, in our strength to be followers of Jesus and catchers of people. We will not believe in race or riches, in privileges, in the established order.
Within our darkest night, you kindle the fire that never dies away, never dies away. Within our darkest night.
We want to believe in the equality of all human beings, and that the order of force, violence, and injustice is a disorder. We will not believe that we do not have to concern ourselves with what happens far from here and to our common home.
Within our darkest night, you kindle the fire that never dies away, never dies away. Within our darkest night.
We want to believe that all people are neighbors and that the whole planet is our home and that we all reap what we all sow. We will not believe that we can combat oppression out there if we tolerate injustice at home, at work, here.
Within our darkest night, you kindle the fire that never dies away, never dies away. Within our darkest night.
We want to believe that what is right is the same here as it is there, and that we will not be free while even one human being is excluded. We will not believe that war and hunger are inevitable or that peace is inaccessible.
Within our darkest night, you kindle the fire that never dies away, never dies away. Within our darkest night.
We want to believe in the love of open hands and open hearts, and that peace on earth is possible. We will not believe that any effort is in vain. We will not believe that this dream continues being only a dream.
Within our darkest night, you kindle the fire that never dies away, never dies away. Within our darkest night.
We dare to believe in the dream of God in following Jesus, that we can be catchers of people. We believe in a new heaven, a new earth where mercy and justice reign.
Within our darkest night, you kindle the fire that never dies away, never dies away. Within our darkest night.
Thank you, Joyce. Now we'll hear from our Executive Director, Johnny Zokovich.
Thanks so much, Nancy. Hi, everybody. I'm Johnny Zakovich. I'm the Executive Director of Pax Christi USA, and it's really, really good to be with y'all today. I had hoped to be there in person with you. I'm just over in St. Louis, so not far at all from where y'all are physically gathering together. But after doing a quick run through, we decided technologically that it made more sense for me to provide some tech assistance from afar rather than be in the room with y'all today. But I'm still just really, really excited about being able to gather with you. As many of y'all know, Tom Cordaro, who is a member of Pax Christi Illinois, is a longtime mentor of mine. So anytime that I get to do anything that involves Tom, I jump at the chance. Tom has just been an extraordinary leader within Pax Christi USA for a very long time. And I know that I'm just one of the people who have really benefited from his leadership and from his mentorship. And so again, I'm just really, really glad to be with y'all. Glad to see the energy that is happening despite the pandemic, and glad that you, as one of the first Pax Christi sections during the pandemic, to be able to gather together physically, that you're able to do that and to be with one another, because we know how important community is. So again, I'm just really excited to be with y'all here too. And one of the things I just want to point out before I introduce our keynote speaker, for those of y'all who don't know, this coming year, 2022, is the Jubilee anniversary of Pax Christi USA. It's our 50th anniversary. And we're making plans at the national office. We've already sent out a save the date for the national conference, which will be taking place August 5th through the 7th in Washington, DC. We hope that y'all will be there with us. You only get one chance to celebrate your 50th birthday. So we're just really hoping as many people as possible can plug in this year and celebrate with us. And we also hope to be able to come from the national office and celebrate with y'all in Illinois at some point also. So on to our keynote speaker today. It gives me just incredible pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker that your leadership chose for y'all this weekend. You know Bishop Stowe as the Pax Christi USA Bishop-President, and an extraordinary one at that. Whether the issue is labor rights and his support for the PRO Act, whether it's care for creation, or his love of the people of Appalachia and his work with the Catholic Committee of Appalachia, whether it's issues around racial justice. Just this past August, he did a talk for catechists on why Black Lives Matter, Catholic perspectives on racism. And we know from our national conference this year, when we gave the Pax Christi USA Teacher of Peace Award to Brian Massengale, how Brian singled him out for his support and his gratitude for all of the care and concern and support that Bishop Stowe has shown Brian in his own work for racial justice. We know too, from his time serving in El Paso, where he was the moderator of the Curia and Vicar General of the diocese, that he worked on border issues and how his presence there with the immigrant community was such an important, both symbolic and practical vision of what the church is called to be. Bishop Stowe has spoken out and opened wide the doors of our church, especially to LGBTQ youth. He was one of the signers, one of the few bishops who signed on to a statement released by the Tyler Clementi Foundation, an organization that fights LGBTQ bullying in schools, workplaces, and faith communities. A statement that told young people who were LGBTQ that God created you, God loves you, and God is on your side. This is the kind of prophetic leadership that Bishop Stowe provides our community. Whether it's voting rights or military spending, whether it's nuclear disarmament or issues of human life and dignity across the spectrum, he is always a prophetic and pastoral voice. At the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, he has served on the Committee for the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, the Bishops' Anti-Poverty Initiative, and he has a long history of working on social justice and peace concerns, extending back all the way to his time as a student in Berkeley, as part of a Pax Christi USA local group there. Whether it's in his Easter message from this past April, or whether it's in the letter that he issued as we awaited the results of this election, we know that we can count on him to provide our community the kind of depth of wisdom and the kind of visionary leadership that an organization like Pax Christi USA needs. He is in many ways our own reflection of Pope Francis, and he demonstrates the kind of leadership that Pope Francis has called for from our bishops and our pastors, for them to offer the people of God. And we are just so lucky and fortunate to have him. And with great pleasure, let me introduce to y'all Bishop John Stowe.
Thank you, Johnny. I'm turning a little red from that introduction, but I hope I can live up to some part of it. I'm really happy to be with Pax Christi Illinois on this day, and Johnny and I are both very interested in connecting as much as we can with you on the grassroots, you on the local levels who make Pax Christi the movement that it's called to be. Pax Christi USA would be nothing without all of the local groups that are so engaged in the issues that affect your local communities, national communities, and the broader international community. And Tom Cordaro is somebody I've read his stuff since I was a kid, so I'm just honored to be in his presence, even if virtually right now, and all the legends that are part of our Pax Christi movement. In 50 years, what an impact. And I think we're looking forward to seeing the fruits of those 50 years and to challenge ourselves to do even more in the next 50 years. So it's great to be with you and great to be part of your regional gathering. The title that you selected for this time together, A Time of Reckoning, I would have had no way of knowing how concrete and real that title would become to me on the very week that we are having this gathering. A Time of Reckoning. It was last Sunday night when a priest in our diocese living where Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky come together at the Cumberland Gap was on the phone talking to a doctor friend of his and complaining about muscle aches in his body because he had been working out, tending the rose garden and stretching himself in ways that he was not accustomed to be stretched. But he also mentioned chest pains in the midst of that, which caused his doctor to be concerned. And she told him, you know, you're young, you're in good shape, but don't ignore something as serious as chest pains. Make sure you check that out if they last. He told her at that time, you know, none of us have another day guaranteed. And right after saying those words, collapsed, fell dead of a massive heart attack while she was on the phone. She heard a gurgling sound twice and thought he was playing with her. And she said, cut that out, it's not funny. But it turned out it wasn't funny at all. It was indeed his time of reckoning. We know that he lived a faithful life. We know that he was beloved by the communities that he served. We know the selflessness of coming from a country far away in a culture that was so different than our own, with little preparation to serve in the United States, and how generously and openly he gave himself to our local church. And we know what a sense of loss we experience, which is small in comparison to what his family back home experiences. So a time of reckoning reminds us of, as our funeral rite says, the brevity of our time on earth. But it also reminds us of how the church and how our tradition and how people who are peace builders should be understanding time itself. Sometimes the things that we have such a great sense of urgency about become less important with the passing of 24 hours. And some things that we think we have all kinds of time to work on end up being right in our face before we're ready to confront them. As Christians, we believe in the importance of history, especially because in the incarnation, God enters into history. And the two ingredients of history are space and time. Our liturgy strives to sanctify time. Our liturgical year highlights different aspects of time and place for our edification, for our growth, and for our commitment to service. As Christians who believe that God entered into human history as one of us, as a brother to us in the person of Jesus, we believe that time is both cyclical and linear, combining two very different concepts of how people of the ancient world understood time. The cyclical nature of time is obvious to us as we flow through, at least in Illinois and in the part of the country where I live, 4 seasons each year. We're still enjoying some of the glories of the fall colors, even as the temperatures begin to dip. And we have that seasonal mark of passage by turning our clocks back tonight. Don't forget, 1 hour. The seasons remind us of that cyclical nature of time. But as we enter this month of November, not only in the midst of fall and after the harvest has been gathered in, when we move towards our national day of giving thanks, we as Catholic Christians recall the dead, those who are around God's throne, those great peacemakers, and those who live the gospel message of the Beatitudes through every time and place, perfectly or imperfectly, who are now around God's throne, sharing in that glory. We celebrate them at the beginning of this month, and then we remember those who are on their way, our beloved ones that we'd like to believe are in that great number and around God's throne. We celebrate a month of recalling those who have gone before us. Think of the peacemakers that our own movement has lost in just recent times, people who are giants among us and have shown us the way. As people of faith, we don't only mourn their passing and our loss, but we honor their memory by following their example. The communion of saints is given to us as a great example of heroes, of people who can demonstrate in their humanity, in their limitations, in their human actuality, that it is possible to live the gospel message of peace. It's possible to keep on working at reconciliation. It's possible to resist that human tendency to violence and to help make the conditions possible for others to refrain from violence. We have a wonderful company of saints that the letter of Hebrews describes as a great cloud of witnesses, the cheering stand, the cheering section of the stands that's waiting for each of us to cross that ultimate finish line and be welcomed into the fullness of that kingdom that we pray to be part of establishing in the here and now. This season of November begins, and we know that there are so many things that are familiar about it. But we also know we're not in the same place that we were last November. And at the end of the month, not only do we celebrate Thanksgiving Day, but we move into the Advent season and a new beginning of the church year. We start over from a familiar place, and at the same time, we look backwards to our ancestors in the faith, our older sisters and brothers who longed for a Messiah, and we look forward to the coming of the Prince of Peace who will establish that peace once and for all and establish the justice that we strive for but can't fully realize. But November 2021 is not the same as November 2020 or November 1920 or November 1820. Each year we are in a different place as a human family. We're in a different place as an organization. We're in a different place in each of our personal lives. Time is linear because we are going somewhere, but it's circular. It's repetitive. And so we can think of the image of a spiral. We go back, but we also make progress going forward. In that introduction, Johnny mentioned the time that I spent on the US-Mexico border in El Paso. And another dimension of my ministry there is I was pastor of a parish. You can see some of the pottery on the shelf behind me that was located on a Native American reservation. The Tigua Pueblo, the only Pueblo Indians that reside in Texas. They were captured by the Spaniards and served as the guides to the Spaniards after the Pueblo Revolt in 1680 and made their establishment in what is now El Paso, but precedes the city and the other settlements there by a long time. In that parish community are descendants of the original members of the parish rolls when that tribe settled there in Isleta. Their family members are still part of that parish today. The church that they built at that time has been on both sides of the Rio Grande, and at one time right in the middle of it as it was washed away and then rebuilt within a year. But it gives a different perspective to migration because both sides of the Rio Grande were Mexico at the time. And the people there, as many of the borderlands people say, we didn't cross any border, the border crossed us. But these Native Americans there have a beautiful tradition on their feast day, the Feast of St. Anthony of Padua on June 13th, a custom they brought with them from the pueblos of New Mexico. And they do a dance called the figura or the figure. And it would look to most of us like a figure eight, but it's a dance that is done while they are walking. It's a dance that is done in procession. And it begins with somebody running ahead. The first dancer is called the runner, and he sets the course and runs out, but then he figures back, making almost a figure 8 in the way that it's done. And that whole body, sometimes 200 dancers, are moving in this pattern from the church to the Tusla, which is their ceremonial headquarters, and then they do it going back from the Tusla to the church again. Now, the elders of the tribe use that image to teach their young people a valuable lesson about life. The runner represents every person who arrives at the age of maturity, adulthood, and has to seek out on a course of life for themselves. They have to set out into the world apart to some extent from their traditions and family, apart from the restraints that come from those who would characterize them or categorize them as a certain way. They have to set out on their own. But as soon as that runner gets to the point that he can no longer hear the beat of the drum, which is at the end of the procession, he needs to circle back so he can hear that heartbeat, as they call it, once again, remembering where he comes from, remembering the course of life. It's a beautiful lesson for young people who will venture out into the world, but should never get so far away that they lose the sense of that heartbeat, that they lose that sense of their identity, who they are from and where they're going. It shows us in a very graphic way that cyclical and that spiral nature of time. So we approach the end of our calendar year, and we approach the beginning of a new liturgical year in the season of Advent. Advent is a time liturgically and spiritually that is meant to be a new beginning. Again, we look backwards and connect with the heartbeat of the past, our Jewish roots and traditions, the people who longed for a Savior who would set things right. We're invited to dream with the prophets who had incredible ideas about what the day of the Lord would be like, and who knew that no matter what their vision was, words would fall short of describing it. So we hear especially the prophet Isaiah, whose dreams are recounted in the words of scriptures. He dreams of things like lions and lambs lying down together. He dreams of things like swords being beaten into plowshares. He dreams of things that he has yet to see in the natural or human world, but that he thinks are what it's all about when God's way is established as sovereign. We are not where we were last year at the beginning of Advent. Hopefully, we've made some progress in overcoming the pandemic with the vaccine, and now with the most recent availability of the vaccine to young people. But we haven't come very far either in terms of overcoming our polarization, making progress as a nation in establishing a firm justice, or in realizing the vision that Pope Francis laid out so beautifully for us in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti. Not at all original with Pope Francis. The words come from St. Francis, the vision comes from the gospel, and we can find it in those ancient Hebrews prophets that we will hear during these weeks of Advent. God made us one family, one people, and we are to live as brothers and sisters. And the fact that God himself chose not only to be creator and a father, but chose to become brother and live in our midst as one of us, accepting all the limitations of the human condition, that tells us something about our dignity as human beings and our responsibility to recognize that kinship, those familial ties that call to fraternity. We know that the Greeks had two different words for time. They used chronos and they used kairos. Chronos has its legacy in our words like chronological, when we put things in order of the historical time in which they occurred, or synchronized, as in swimmers who are completely in step because they're doing everything at the same time. And then kairos is less clear in our Anglo-American world, but kairos means the kind of time that isn't measured, the kind of time for an opportunity, the kind of time when things are on the brink of transformation. As members of Pax Christi, we hope to always be on the brink of transformation, because just like the Hebrew prophets of old who longed for a savior, we're not satisfied with how things are. And even if we're happier with the president we had than the president we had a year ago, we are not yet satisfied that justice is being done. And even if we've seen advances in so many areas of our life, even in something as close to us as the pandemic, we're not yet where we need to be. Chronologically, we know that the calendar continues, and November always has 30 days. And every one of those days always has 24 hours, and every one of those hours always has 60 minutes, and every one of those minutes always has 60 seconds. But tell me if you don't know that 60 minutes in a dentist's office waiting for a procedure seem an awful lot longer than 60 minutes at a fiesta when you're celebrating a birthday of someone that you love. We know that time, while measurable, is not experienced that way. The kairos that we are invited to enter into, the kairos with which Jesus began his public ministry, now is the time. Now is the time for repentance and conversion. That's the time of reckoning that we are talking about here. The time of reckoning that we should be always about as members of Pax Christi. I'd like to reflect with you on the gospel that will be coming up on the first Sunday of Advent in the new cycle of readings, cycle C, which focuses on the Gospel of Luke. And if you don't know it, Luke's is the gospel that emphasizes the role of Mary more than any other gospel, the role of the Holy Spirit, especially active in Mary at the birth of Jesus, the role of the church formed by that Spirit, including Mary in prayer, the gospel that shows Jesus most frequently at prayer in communion with his Father, and the gospel that emphasizes the importance of the poor and the challenges that the rich face if they strive to enter the kingdom of God. The gospel that we will hear on the first Sunday of Advent, as you probably know, doesn't talk about shepherds or mangers, doesn't talk about any of the things that we associate with the Christmas season, but rather talks about the first part of Advent, which counterintuitively points us towards the second, not the first coming of Jesus. Reminds us that even what the prophets long awaited and was fulfilled in Jesus awaits further fulfillment in the kingdom of God. Jesus said to his disciples, "There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on earth nations will be in dismay, perplexed by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will die of fright and anticipation of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these signs begin to happen, stand erect and raise your heads, because your redemption is at hand. Beware that your hearts do not become drowsy from carousing and drunkenness and the anxieties of daily life, and that day catch you by surprise like a trap. For that day will assault everyone who lives on the face of the earth. Be vigilant at all times and pray that you have the strength to escape the tribulations that are imminent and to stand before the Son of Man." Signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and nations being in dismay doesn't sound very different from today's news. Doesn't sound too different from the context in which we find ourselves in this November 2021. And you know, Christians in most eras could say the same about their reality. Sometimes we run the tendency to interpret these apocalyptic texts as though they were threats and meant to frighten us. But the community to which this gospel was written, that already knew persecution, that already knew hardship, that already knew difficulty, that already knew what it was like to be the outcasts, They didn't see threats in these words. They recognized their present reality, as we should. They focused not on the moon and the stars and all of the dangerous signs in the skies, but on the invitation to stand up and be counted. They focused on the Son of Man coming in glory right in the midst of it, just as Christ came the first time into the midst of the messiness of the human condition, the messiness of a world marred by sin. It's a mistake when Christians think they can separate themselves out of the world. It's a mistake when Christians think that we're above politics and can't get our hands dirty in the struggles of other people. We just pray our way out of things rather than engage in the human struggle. It's a mistake. It's a mistake because Christ did not separate himself. God did not separate himself from the human condition, but rather joined with the human condition, became one with us, and joined that struggle to establish a different order in the world, a different order in time. When Jesus calls the poor in spirit and those who mourn and those who are meek and those who hunger and thirst for justice and those who are persecuted, blessed and happy, that's not the world in which we live. They're not seen that way. But they are seen that way by God. And because they recognize their dependence on God and their interdependence on another, even for mere survival, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, is far more open and accessible to them than to those who think they have it all under control and have everything the way it's supposed to be, and who are indifferent to the needs and the sufferings of others. That gospel which presents natural signs of doom and gloom and human signs of persecution calls for vigilance. And at this time of reckoning, we need to be vigilant. We need to be vigilant that we don't give in to the way of thinking of the world around us because it's easier or more practical or more comfortable or less threatening to our neighbors. We can't let the moments that we have experienced, the marches in the streets with the Black Lives Matter movement, the desire to make significant change in the climate catastrophe that we're experiencing, the desire to put an end to nuclear weapons and the construction of new forms of weaponry and arms and the trade and sale of these things, the harsh reality towards immigrants, all those things continue, and we have to be vigilant because just because they're no longer the top news story or catching our attention, doesn't mean they're not still real issues. Stand erect and raise your heads, for your salvation is near at hand. The opportunity for witnessing. And remember that the Greek word witness is martyr. The opportunity for witnessing is at hand. And we're called to be faithful witnesses. You call this time, this session, a time of reckoning. So we talked about time. We talked about the nature of time. We talked about the spirituality of time and the significance of time because of the incarnation, God entering into human history. And what do we mean by reckoning? What do we mean by reckoning? We mean something like sorting things out. We mean something like getting things straight or as they should be, or getting it right. Perhaps it's preparing for what's next. A day of reckoning has a hint about justice in it. Reckoning means somebody's going to have to pay for this. Reckoning means the account is due. Reckoning means taking some responsibility, paying the bill. How do we reckon with the need for peace at this time of reckoning? How do we reckon with our own spirituality and our gift to the church of being Pax Christi, being called to incarnate the peace of Christ? You know, Jesus proclaimed peace at a time when the Roman world was proud of its own notion of peace, the so-called Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which simply meant as long as you keep people happy, bread and circuses, as long as you satisfy basic needs and And let people live, let them be on their own. But if there's ever an uprising, if there's ever discontent, then you have to establish order. The Pax Romana was simply the absence of war. And if some incident of war arose, get rid of it. Why does Pontius Pilate wash his hands when the crowd is crying for the blood of Jesus? He's already proclaimed him innocent. He's already said he's done nothing to deserve this. But as the crowd cries out, he gives in. The Pax Romana, the absence of violence and war, even at the cost of violence and war. But we know that the peace that Jesus proclaimed is much closer to the Hebrew concept of shalom, about a wholeness, about a way of being, and about the very interrelatedness of the human family that Pope Francis keeps calling our attention to in these polarized times. To be the peace of Christ, to represent the shalom, the peace that this world does not give, a peace that is more than the absence of war, but has to do with right relationships with all. With what are we reckoning and what gets in the way of that peace? Again, the categories that come to mind very quickly are the buildup of nuclear weaponry. Only this week, we've heard that our government has understated the amount of nuclear capacity that the Chinese have. So we've already created a new enemy for this time period in history, and now we have to build up resistance to that new enemy and the weapons that new enemy has. Remember when North Korea was the big threat and it was on the news every other day? We don't hear a peep about North Korea as of late. But more dangerously, we don't hear about what our own nuclear capacity continues to be, and how with our latest conflicts with Russia, how there's an underground, almost hidden efforts to rebuild and recapacitate so much of that nuclear force. We know that members of Pax Christi have regularly been expressing outright disappointment, have risked their own safety and well-being to protest, have called attention to this, but it seems that most of the world isn't paying attention. We're thinking about other things and other important things like the virus, the pandemic, and like climate change. I think part of Pax Christi's role is to help everyone see the interconnectedness of all these things, that they're not just isolated. So we have to, at one time, continue to educate ourselves and be, as Jesus said, as shrewd as serpents while being gentle as doves in watching what's going on in the development of nuclear arms. We have to continue to advocate not just for reduction, although that's a step, but for the elimination of nuclear arms. And we have to advocate even in our church to make it absolutely clear that this kind of weaponry is opposed to the gospel, not to dance around theories and justifications, but to make it clear, as Pope Francis has done, that the arms industry takes literally food out of the mouths of the poor. It adds to the climate difficulties that we experience. It adds to the problems of migration, forcing people to leave their homelands and go elsewhere. Between war and climate change, we have the greatest causes for migration in our world today. We live in a nation that's much more concerned about protecting its borders than in changing the situations, the conditions that make it necessary for people to migrate. Much less do we think about how we create those very situations and conditions ourselves. Whether it's our use of drugs in the drug trade, whether it's our overconsumption of the earth's goods, or whether it's our stockpiling of nuclear weapons, there's something to repent of. There's something that needs to be changed in this time of reckoning. As we further reflect on what we've learned or haven't learned from the pandemic, from this global phenomenon where a virus, an invisible virus, brings nations and peoples all over the world to their knees and could stop a world of commerce, could stop everything that we think is unstoppable. A virus brings it to a halt. And yet, I think Cardinal Tobin has used the word that best describes this time as it is apocalyptic. Apocalyptic has the double meaning of what is hidden and is to be revealed. So very much like the nuclear weaponry and nuclear stockpiling and building up that we're not always aware of, but continues to go on, it needs to be revealed. And the pandemic itself revealed so many of the inequities in our society, so many of the inequities that people of color face, as opposed to those who benefit from white privilege, whether we like to acknowledge it or not. The system is rigged in the favor of those of us whose skin is lighter. Apocalypse makes that come clear. The curtain is pulled back. Something is revealed. The marches after the killing of George Floyd and the slow but genuine recognition of how frequent killings of unarmed Black people by people in positions of authority and power, especially police forces, has revealed a real sadness, a real inequity, a real injustice in our system. We want quick solutions. We don't want to do the long work of the reform that's necessary. We don't want to apply our traditional Pax Christi steps of prayer, study, and action. That's not popular in the world today. We want the quick fix that makes everybody happy all at once. And that is always going to be elusive. The polarization that the pandemic has revealed more clearly, that the last occupant of the White House revealed very clearly and used for his own purposes, the polarization that has found its way into our church, even as we celebrate the sacrament of unity. That polarization is a major threat to the kind of shalom that Jesus proclaims. It's not coincidental that the most frequent complaint that Paul has in all of his letters sounds so contemporary. He's worried about those who are creating divisions. And he finds all kinds of ways that people decide to divide themselves. I was baptized by Paul. I was baptized by Peter. I was baptized by Apollos. We still have all kinds of ways to divide ourselves. This time of reckoning has to, as Pope Francis again reminds us, to recognize what we have in common. Recognize what the birth of the child in Bethlehem meant to say to the human family. That we are all connected, that this is our common family member, the brother to all of us. In this time of reckoning, how should we as Pax Christians reckon? How should we as Pax Christians respond? What should we be focused on? Seems like there's so many things that we can focus on. It's easy to be distracted, or it's easy to give up because the problems are too big, too enormous for any of us to get a grasp on. Fortunately, we have different working groups within Pax Christi, and we've been very deliberate about creating opportunities for people to address a great number of issues. Johnny and the team in Washington, D.C. have facilitated multi-pronged issues so that we can address as an organization the impact of racism, and so that we can continue to pay attention to the development of nuclear weapons, and so that we can continue to pay attention to the violence that is inflicted upon migrants and refugees crossing our border, and so that we can continue to pay attention to the kinds of injustices that threaten the peace, the shalom of right relationships. There's something for everybody's area of interest and ways to be involved that our national staff can help you with. Pope Francis says our way to respond begins with believing in what he's bold or crazy enough to call a politics of love. Think about politics of love. He talks about not only is politics a noble vocation, but politics in the best sense of the word is about building up the common good, and it's an expression of love. The centerpiece of the encyclical Fratelli Tutti is the Good Samaritan. And what Francis reminds us of, as much as the Good Samaritan was a hero, he was also an outsider with no standing in that community. He assists somebody who could have very well been oppressive towards himself, but he doesn't do it alone. He has to bring the wounded person on the road to the innkeeper, and he has to require the help of the innkeeper to nurse the man back to health, to feed him, and to take care of him. The Good Samaritan has other things to do, must be on his way, but he doesn't abandon the man. He promises to come back, pay his bill, and take care of him. It's that kind of ability to reverse the trend of discrimination, the ability to reverse the attitude towards the one who is wounded. But Pope Francis says in a time of reckoning, we have to ask ourselves in that parable, who am I? Am I the wounded one, beaten up and left on the road? Many of our minority communities would find themselves identifying with that person on the road, beaten up and left for dead. Many of those who cannot seem to get ahead in the economy, the way that it is created, the way it's organized, feel like that person in the road. Whole populations whose livelihoods are affected by climate change, or whose islands are soon going to be underwater, can feel like that person in the road. Or are we the bystander who has a good excuse, a very good excuse, we have to be on our way, and it's just too much. There's nothing we can do. Somebody else's problem. Or can we really be like the Good Samaritan or the innkeeper, helping the one who's taken the initiative, supporting the one that's taken the initiative, and using our own abilities to bring about healing? Fratelli Tutti calls us to fraternity, to brotherhood, but not just in philosophical terms, not just in theory, but calls us to that in real life. And that's where the politics comes in. We have to have a politics of love that opts for solutions for the common good and not individual interests. Our Latin American brothers and sisters for decades talked about the process of conscientization. And maybe because it's so hard to say in English, it never really caught on, but it's about raising consciousness, that we can say. Not being indifferent, but paying attention to what's going on. Very similar to our prayer, study, and action is the threefold method of see, judge, and act. See what's going on, evaluate what's going on. Is it good? Is it bad? What should we do about it? And then act. Prayer, study, and action. There's so much that is vying for our attention. We have to select what we can be attentive to, but we can all be attentive to something. And it's all the pieces of it together that will help to create a more peaceful world when we can address all of it. We can't say, well, this year we're going to focus on racism and forget about the rest. Or next year we're going to focus on migration and forget about the rest. It's all connected and we can't do everything at once. So how do we balance all of that? We follow what we are best equipped to deal with and what we can do collectively, the process that the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius called discernment. We have to discern what is it that we can do. Each Pax Christi chapter should be engaged in discernment. Pax Christi USA has to be engaged in discernment, especially as we come upon 50 years and have to chart a course for the future. The whole church is supposed to be in a process of discernment, as Pope Francis has opened this synodal process, talking about how do we walk together into the future. Conscientization, the common good, conscientization. And we can't underestimate the importance of resistance to evil, to be actively resisting things that could so easily corrupt us. It's so easy to think that we can go back to normal because the Black Lives Matter people are not in the streets every night. And little by little, all of the effects that they had and the consciousness that they were able to raise, we can watch city councils, we can watch state legislatures, we can watch national bodies try to suppress voting rights, try to undermine all of those efforts that they made for advancement, and people aren't paying attention. With the excuse of the pandemic, so many local governments went to all virtual ways of governing. How do you do citizen participation? Sure, you can use something like Zoom, but somebody controls who can speak and who can't. Somebody controls who has access to the halls where decisions are made. Resistance is when we have to say, I can't be part of that system. Some have taken prophetic gestures over the years, resisting to pay taxes because they don't want money to go to programs that are so antithetical to our vision of peace. How can we resist? At least resist the corruption that allows us to just go along to get along. Everyone knows the famous saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and it is true enough. But sometimes we forget the other side of that coin, that powerlessness corrupts as well. And when we feel helpless to do anything, we easily give in to letting the powerful do it for us. Common good, conscientization, resistance. We can't buy into the systemic racism. We can't buy into the attitude that might makes right. We can't buy into the attitude that it's okay if only some people have access to the things that the world needs. In our own time of reckoning here, and this time as we approach the season of Advent, as Pax Christians, let's think about preparing for more than Christmas. Christmas has become a day. Christmas has become an event. Christmas has become a marketing scheme. We have to prepare for more than Christmas. We prepare for the second coming of Christ, and we prepare for the birth of the Prince of Peace. Remember, it's the prophecy of a little child who will lead them. A little child who will lead them. The prophecies that Isaiah spoke of and dreamed of are so much a part of our Advent liturgies. I'm going to read another section from our liturgy. This is from the prophet Isaiah, and it's the second Sunday of Advent reading for year A, but it really captures the whole Advent season and captures the spirituality, I think, of Pax Christi itself. On that day, a shoot shall sprout from the stump of Jesse, and from his roots a bud shall blossom. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and of strength, the spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord, and his delight shall be the fear of the Lord. Not by appearance shall he judge, nor by hearsay shall he decide, but he shall judge the poor with justice and decide aright for the land's afflicted. He shall strike the ruthless with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. Justice shall be the band around his waist, and faithfulness a belt upon his hips. Then the wolf shall be guest of the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid. The calf and the young lion shall browse together, with the little child to lead them. The cow and the bear shall be neighbors, together their young shall rest. The lion shall eat hay like the ox, the baby shall play by the cobra's den, and the child lay his hand in the adder's lair. There shall be no harm or ruin on all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be filled with knowledge of the Lord, as water covers the sea. The realization of that dream is what we long for in Advent, is what we prepare for as disciples of peaceful Christ. We want to see lions lie down with lambs, and of course, Isaiah isn't just talking about animals in the natural world. If we want to see swords beaten into plowshares, it's going to require something on our part. If we want to see our planet preserved for future generations, it's going to require ongoing simplification of our lifestyles, to lower our consumption, to reuse, repurpose, and recycle, as the saying goes, but to reduce, above all, what we consume. We believe in our liturgy is based on transformation. As Catholics, we gather around the Eucharistic table and see the elements of bread and wine, fruit of the earth, and the work of human hands transformed into the body of Christ, that we who receive it are transformed into the body of Christ. For us, Eucharist and reconciliation are much more than gestures. They're the prophetic ushering in of a new world that we want to be part of. Our time of reckoning perhaps has to begin with the desire, the longing for, and the dreaming of what it might be like. We can read the signs of the times. They're hard to avoid. How will we respond to those times? What will our prayer, study, and action look like as Pax Christi Illinois, as Pax Christi USA, as individuals and families in this challenging yet hopeful time? Chronologically, November 2021, but it's also a moment of Kairos. What are we on the verge of becoming? Those are my reflections for you. Thank you for your interest, and hopefully we can have a little discussion based on some of those ideas.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bishop Stowe. At this time, we would like, if anyone wishes to have questions for the bishop, if you would come up, you can come next to me and ask the bishop a question. And we will allow about 20 to 30 minutes for this if necessary. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Bishop.
Good afternoon.
It's nice finally meeting you. My name is Tom Cordaro also.
I recognize you. Thank you.
Yeah. And when you said that you had read stuff of mine when you were a student, that made me feel very, very old.
I'm sorry about that, but it's wisdom. That's the price of wisdom.
Okay, all right. So anyway,
He is old, by the way. I'm just going to comment that. So go ahead, Tom.
Anyway, first, I just really appreciate and want to give you my thanks for all that you do for Pax Christi and the prophetic witness you give on so many levels and so many different kinds of venues and for so many issues. I wanted to get back to talking a little bit about polarization and what's going on in our church. About a month ago, I read this wonderful message that Pope Francis gave to the 4th annual gathering, world gathering of popular movements.
Yes.
It was a beautiful piece filled with gratitude and ways of encouragement to the popular movements across the world. Then a couple days ago, I saw an article about a video that our Archbishop Gomez is doing for another international gathering in Madrid. But it was filled with an incredible amount of cruelty, really cruel language and condemnations of popular movements around the world. Without trying to get into a situation where you're throwing epithets or you're responding angrily at what the Archbishop has said. My concern is that if nothing is said, if we do not respond and find a way of responding, which takes issue with what the Archbishop is saying in his remarks, then his remarks become a weapon in the hands of so many people out here who can use it to demonize us and further marginalize us in the church. So how do we respond in a way that does not further the polarization, but does not allow the Archbishop's message to become the narrative going forward that further is used to marginalize people like us?
You named very well a dilemma that I've been pondering, especially this morning in prayer. Either side can blame the other for polarization, and then anything that you continue to add to the discussion is seen as furthering the polarization. But I think the only response we come back with is truth. And I think the Archbishop Gomez's words have to be challenged on their basis in fact or reality, and the lack thereof. So I'm very concerned that he would say something so evidently contrary to what the Holy Father says. And then he has a position not only as the Archbishop of the largest diocese in the United States, but is currently the president of the Bishops' Conference. Usually he's more quiet, but to make a speech like that and really call into question the motives of people that are marching in the street and ignoring the Christian roots of so much of the civil rights movement, the Christian roots of so much of the social justice movements. And I think the better question for him would have been, if you think they're creating another religion, why has Catholicism not spoken to them or drawn on our best resources to be meaningful to the people who know that things have to change? The very Advent longings that I was describing moments ago are to be found in the people that are marching in the streets, are to be found in those who are working for social change. The Holy Father can understand that, and perhaps it's because of his closeness to the poor in Argentina. We would think that a Mexican-born leader in the United States would have a voice for the underserved, for the minority populations, for the immigrants, and he does speak out pretty forcefully on immigration issues very often. That is Archbishop Gomez. But how do you assign these kind of motives to people who are genuinely working for change? That they may not be motivated by the gospel, but we can certainly find common ground with people who are motivated by the gospel, and many of them are, in fact, motivated by the gospel. He also manipulates some of Pope Francis's language. He talks about the Pelagian threats. He manipulates or takes out of context quotes from Dorothy Day. He suggests that utopia is just a fantasy rather than moving us towards the kingdom of God. It's, sets up a straw man argument and then weakens it. It's the basic argument against the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, contemporary times. So your question had more to do with how do we address that? I think it's by bringing out the truth and saying what many prominent speakers are saying. Brian Massengill himself is saying, some of our membership is saying, other African-American leaders, African-American publications are just going to have to call forth this. And those of us who are white also have to say that that is inappropriate. I'm discerning myself what is the best response, and together with Johnny and with our leadership in Pax Christi USA, what should our organizational response be? But it can't be left unchallenged.
Thank you, Tom. Anyone? Doug?
Okay. Yeah, hi, my name is Doug Casper, and I've been reading lately about two initiatives coming out of the Vatican. One is the 7-year plan to try to get every diocese, every parish, every person involved in the environmental issue. And the other one is this 2-year plan to call it a Synod for listening. I was just wondering, I've been trying to listen and, feel for that happening here in our diocese, and I haven't yet, either one of those issues that are coming out of the Vatican. And I feel they're very, very important. I wonder if you could respond.
Sure, I share your sense that they're important, and I haven't yet studied that 7-year plan, but I'm glad that the Holy Father made his presence known, even if he couldn't be there physically at the COP meeting in Scotland. and wants to have the whole church have an impact on this movement to save the planet. He's been consistent in that, and now it's time to put it into action. So having concrete plans is something that's going to be necessary. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to look to the U.S. Conference of Bishops to provide leadership for that. So there's going to be other ways for leadership to surface. Pax Christi is going to be one of them. And the coalition that we have with many of the social justice movements, just where our office is in Washington, D.C. and across the country, is going to have to become stronger. Grassroots are going to be the way that this is going to take place. I wish I knew more about the 7-year plan. I certainly know what our teaching is about the environment and the importance of it, but I'm glad to have a tool that moves us to some kind of practical implementation in the way that we can. I think the thing that we resist most is the conversion to consuming less. That's going to be the bottom line. So we have all kinds of technical plans, and Pope Francis keeps telling us we're not going to be able to get our way out of this technologically. We're going to have to make some changes. And I hope that 7-year plan involves that, but also makes it very concrete. Now, synodality should be happening wherever you are. It should be happening. I know that Cardinal Supich has started a process in Chicago. I would hope that in the province of Illinois, all of the state of Illinois, that would be happening. I keep telling people to stay tuned. I can tell you, even in my diocese, I know that people are not familiar yet with the term, and we've had to use a big program, but the time right now really to roll out the plan, to teach what it is, and then provide some kind of implementation. But Pope Francis has been consistent since he began his papacy that we have to be, if the church is going to be a legitimate teaching church, it also has to be a listening church. And that is very hard to do. And it's very hard for the church in the US that is used to its hierarchical structure to be able to listen to all voices. The Pope has called for creativity in these processes, and perhaps that hasn't been our strong suit, especially when we're used to having so many programs which have a beginning point and an ending point, and the Pope is saying, this isn't just a program to implement. This is going to transform the way of being church so that all voices are heard. I just read a commentary that said that, reaction to synodality right now is not unlike the way that the Roman Curia reacted when John the 23rd announced the Second Vatican Council. All the reasons why it's impractical and why it can't be done, but it is going to happen. So if you're not hearing about it in your parishes, ask. If you're not hearing about it in the diocese, ask what's going on. But that's part of having our voices heard.
Thank you, Doug. Is there anyone else would like to come up and ask the bishop a question? Sure.
Maybe you want to ask Johnny or Nancy something too.
Yeah, well, she's a source of great wisdom as well. Hi, Bishop. I'm Christy Billups.
Hi, Christy.
I teach at Lewis University here in Illinois, and I wonder. I didn't hear in your comments anything referring to the intersectionality of patriarchy. And I know that's a sticky wicket when it comes to the Catholic tradition. And I just wondered how we can raise that up as certainly deeply embedded in some of our imbalances and our striving for right relationship.
You really want me to be in trouble, don't you?
Yes.
About that. Yeah, I mean, it's part of the unjust structures that we just take for granted. And you're absolutely right. Just as the systemic racism has worked into our unconscious thinking, so has that attitude of patriarchy, and especially in a church that has depended on it for so long. It's probably not going to be men like myself that lead us out of that mentality, but I need to be learning about that, and you're quite right to point that out. That was a lack in what I presented.
Anyone else here wish to ask a question? If not, maybe Johnny, you might want to see if there's someone out on the Zoom who wishes to ask a question.
Yes, I've written in the chat box that if anybody had a question, they could write it there and I would share it. So far, there hasn't been anything shared, but the chat box is open.
How often does Pax Christi Illinois meet as a state? Is it annually?
It's an annual gathering.
Is there
yes.
communication among the leaders of different local groups?
We have a fact, it looks like 3 or 4 of us are here today, and we meet regularly, like maybe not quite monthly during the year to plan this and to talk about other things.
Mm-hmm. What kind of issues are important on the state level? Other than the ones that we're all dealing with for sure, but particular to Illinois.
We passed a clean energy bill in Illinois to try and to move towards reducing the coal
Carbon emissions.
Carbon emissions in Illinois. Recently, they passed a bill that a lot of the Catholic folks were against, in allowing women under the age of 18 to not have to go to their parents for permission to have an abortion. That did get passed. But we also have our own police on people of color issues. Of course, one of the main ones was always the Laquan McDonald issue in Chicago.
Right.
We have Jim from Lewis University who wants to ask a question, I believe.
Great.
So I'm going to bring him up.
Great.
Thanks, Nancy. Hello, Bishop. I'm Jim Burke. I teach with Christy at Lewis University, which is a LaSallian and Catholic university here in the Diocese of Joliet. I wanted to just kind of respond to Doug regarding the Laudato Si 7-year plan, the journey plan that Pope Francis has invited all men and women of goodwill throughout the world. He did this on the anniversary of this year of the Laudato Si publishing. Actually, I'm on the Vatican working group for colleges and universities. And what I've seen is that there's an enormous worldwide sort of from the bottom of the church interest and action. So Doug, feel good that it's happening here too in Illinois. And so on November 14th, the Dicastery for the promotion of integral human development is going to launch what is called the Laudato Si Action Platform, which brings together all of the sectors from families to businesses to healthcare institutions to universities to really mobilize the church from below and connect with the marvelous prophetic teaching in Laudato Si. So I just wanted to say that since you can go online, everyone can, Laudato Si actionplatform.org, and there are ways to register and to get involved in all the sectors. My question was, I was really heartened when you talked about Novembering as a time to think of the great peace builders whom we have lost. And I was thinking of Mary Evelyn Jagan and her sister Carol Frances Jagan, Mary Ellsburn, the Franciscan scholar here at Loyola, but also Cardinal Bernardine. And I think this is the 25th anniversary of his death. And I just wondered if that common good project or that he had developed, do you see any sort of still residue of that or a promise for bringing people together now?
I know that initiative is still active, but perhaps not like it was in its heyday, and it's more needed now than ever. I don't know how much energy there is behind it, but I would certainly also include him in those heroes that we remember during this month. And thank you for that contribution about the Laudato Si plan. And it's great to see the universities taking a role in that, especially our Catholic universities. I'm glad that you're on that commission. The Common Ground Initiative is definitely needed for sure, but I know it's part of our pastoral plan in the Diocese of Lexington is how do we come together? So our pastoral plan really dovetails very nicely with the synodality because it's about how do we bring people from diverse backgrounds together and teach us how to listen and to talk to each other. You know, as Pope Francis said in the first synod that he presided over, speak boldly and listen charitably or listen humbly. Those are hard things to do at the same time. It's the steps that we need right now.
We have one other question.
While they're making their way up there, maybe Bishop, I could throw a question out to you just before this fellow jumps in here. Actually, go ahead. Let's have the question from the person there first, Nancy.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, Bishop. I'm Jim Healy, and
Hi, Jim.
respond to your question about what's going on out here. My wife couldn't be here today, so I hope I don't mess up what they've been doing. But it's from Pax Christi Will County, and when our kids were going through high school, we'd go to the graduations, and every year the military representatives would come up and announce, you know, the scholarship that goes to West Point or scholarship that goes. They'd talk about all the money, and everybody would clap, and there'd be all this acclaim. And but there wasn't anybody speaking up from a Pax Christi point of view, or you know, the alternative to a military approach to peacemaking. And so a number of people have been very active, you know, in that area, in our area. And so they created the high school Pax Christi Award. And so all our Catholic high schools for at least 10 years now, not sure. Oh, thank you. Yes. One of the co-sponsors, founders of it just said, it's the Instrument of Peace Award. I knew I would screw this up. Instrument. Thanks, Georgie. It's the Instrument of Peace Award. You actually should be the one up here talking about it. I didn't say that you were here. But anyway, so for at least the last 10 years of all our Catholic high schools, there's an opportunity for, we don't get the opportunity to speak, but the award is given out and the, you know, the credentials for it. And the staff at each of the high schools has to talk to decide who's going to get this on the basis of peacemaking. So I think it's, I'm not sure where else it's going on in the country, but I think it's been very successful here. There's some other wonderful outreach in the high schools to kind of offer the alternatives to a military approach to peacemaking.
Great, thank you. Johnny, we should get a story about that out sometime.
Yeah.
You're muted, Johnny.
Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's a great idea. And Nancy, I would welcome, or Joyce or Bill or whoever to send me some information about that, because we'd love to highlight the winner of that scholarship each year in one of our newsletters and on the website and stuff. That would be terrific. Bishop, I wanted to ask you, myself, I'm sort of a third generation Pax Christi person. I came of age, and got involved with Pax Christi in the mid 90s. And just in looking around this call and seeing online people like Rose Bagley and Sisters Pat and Joanne and Seta, and then in the space there, I think we've already seen Doug Casper and Joyce and Bill Ruhock and Karen and Steve Jackson and those folks that were in many ways, like those folks were mentors to me. They were people that sort of brought me into this movement. and from whom I've learned by being associated with Pax Christi. So this is all to ask, this 50th anniversary to me is a really big deal for Pax Christi USA, that we've been able not just to exist and survive, but to thrive for 50 years. And I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about like what do you see as the main contribution of Pax Christi within the U.S. Catholic Church over this 50 years that we've been around, and what is it that we've brought as a community into the grander conversation within the Catholic Church in the United States?
Sure. I think the short answer to that is a spirituality of nonviolence. There's a lot of peace movements, not enough perhaps, but there's a lot of them. But we have our prayer, study, and action methodology, but really those who have worked to develop the spirituality of nonviolence, which means recognizing in each one of us that tendency towards violence that has to be overcome, the training of ourselves, the discipline that we need to be able to hear others and not contribute to the spiral of violence when we differ and disagree on things. And then allowing that to grow from the personal to the communal and on a much bigger level. So I think that is critical. I think every time that our nation has engaged in some patterns of war, that Pax Christi has provided an alternative vision and some well-founded critiques of those wars. And I think going forward, it's going to be the questioning of the whole just war theory and whether there's any place for that at all in the church today, or whether it's time to return to our pacifist roots as followers of Christ. I think those are really the big things. Now, I think we have the strength of our diversity, and in the last couple of decades, the emphasis on anti-racism has been an important understanding that this spirituality of nonviolence goes to the structural issues as well. And the kind of peace of Christ is going to be based on those right relationships. So we have to dismantle the unjust relationships. And so maybe the next one, as I'm hearing today, is about patriarchy, that we have to start bringing that dimension in too. I hope I'm answering your question, but I think for 50 years, thinking about from the Second World War to where we are today, Pope Francis often talks about a Third World War being fought piecemeal. Yeah. That it's practically the world at war, but it's done in pieces. And I think we have an effective means of speaking out against it. We need to do a lot to bring more conscientious awareness of the threats to peace in our world.
Thanks, Bishop.
Well, one more question here.
I'm going to expose myself to whatever. But I have been mulling about at our parish there's a lack of people making requests for masses to be said. And they're always for people who have died, relatives and friends. What would happen if I asked for a mass to be said for the immigrants at the Texas border?
Oh, I think that's a great idea.
That would be published in the bulletin and announced.
Mm-hmm.
So but not for issues. I think I would keep it that.
Yeah, it's people. That's a very good approach. Yeah, they're not just nameless people. There are human beings. They're mothers and fathers and children, sisters and brothers that are perishing at the border. El Paso had for a long time a mass right on the border, right at the wall, with two tables put together with the wall in the middle of it. And we had the Bishop of Juarez on one side, the Bishop of El Paso and the Bishop of Las Cruces on the other side, but it was one mass through the wall. A very powerful reminder of the reality of division, but that the Eucharist calls us to unity. And one of the most poignant things in that mass was when they brought up at the offertory little shoes and backpacks from kids that perished in the desert, and empty water bottles and things that remind us that there's a human cost to this. So having masses for them, I think, would be a way of getting that message out in a very traditional and Catholic way of doing it, and calling attention to the humanity there.
You wouldn't prevent some people from actually participating in the rest of the mass.
Well, sorry for them, but that's a good.
That would be their problem. Okay. Johnny, do we have any questions on the folks from the folks online?
No, the only question, and this is where Jane is asking Jim, who came up and talked about the Laudato Si platform, if people are going to hear about that in their parishes or in their diocese. And again, I think the same answer that Bishop gave earlier, if you're not hearing about the Laudato Si platform in your parish or diocese, the answer is to ask about it, because certainly I know from our own work and our ties with the Vatican that's a church-wide process that's being asked to be engaged at every level.
And I think Jim was talking about it being at Lewis University, correct?
And I see a question in the chat about why there's not a Pax Christi team in every parish, and I sure wish there were. I don't have an answer to why there isn't, except that we're like the leaven in the dough. We have to keep having an impact bigger than our membership would suggest. Jim, please.
Well, Bishop, and your early on statement that it's a mistake for us not to be engaged in other people's struggles. I think this is, was it Jane who asked the question in the box? I think in the chat. So Jane, I think what Pope Francis is encouraging us to do is to engage with the struggle of poor people around us, especially as we can see it in terms of environmental racism, as a sort of entry point for all of us to move from the inside out, from this sort of conversion that the poor bring us to real action on behalf of the numbers of intersecting issues that the bishop mentioned. But so the Laudato Si Action platform is to be a place of a sort of technological place where we can meet one another, share our plans at any level, whether it's at the grassroots, the middle level in dioceses or in parishes. And so it should be a place where we can network and work together dramatically to step up our action on all of these justice issues that the bishop was talking about.
Thanks, Jim.
Sure.
There is a question, Nancy, from Lois. She's asking Bishop John, she says, we know there is polarization and can cite examples. What are some ways to help in bringing people together?
You know, the small efforts that I've seen that have had the most success are the ones that even in this, with the cautions that are necessary because of the pandemic, but when people come together around food, when people come together around the table, and you start to relate to people as human beings, and you don't start necessarily with the heavy topic, but you find common ground first. In Appalachia, there's a longstanding cultural practice that they refer to as establishing kin. And for those of us who come from outside the region, it seems like you never get anywhere. It takes forever to get anything done. But really, before they'll do any kind of business, the Appalachians have to find some point of connection. So the establishing kin is somebody's mother's, cousin's, nephew's, friend's, neighbor is connected to somebody else's, and they find something in common, and then they can talk, and then they can get something accomplished. They have a language for it, but I think what I've seen in parishes, we tried it with when there was an increase of anti-immigrant sentiment in Lexington. And one of our parishes that's a real leader in Hispanic ministry and was also welcoming to our Congolese refugees. They just started having a trilingual mass once a month, and then had tables, round tables, where people sat and were mixed together, and had some people that had some fluidity and ability to translate, and just help break down the walls by having people break bread together. So sometimes it's the little gestures that humanize the other that can really help us. In our diocesan synod process, I had a great offer by a doctor of all things whose hobby is barbecue. So he's providing barbecue for all of our synod meetings. And so all of the discussion and listening is going to be done over food. And if nothing else, it brings people in.
If you feed them, they will come. Yeah, okay. All right. One more, and that'll be the last.
Yeah, Bishop, I got just one more question, and because it does really bug me, and that we're too white. We're all too white. We're all white here, it seems. And how can we overcome this? You know, we tried reaching out to our Black brothers and sisters, and it just doesn't seem to work.
Well, I wouldn't give up so easily. And I was going to ask you the same thing about how you're doing with diversity. Look at the leadership in the National Council and look at the deliberate ways that we're trying to model the importance of diversity. Look at the efforts that are going on for young adults who, especially those who would be attracted to Pax Christi, are all kind of more naturally integrated and more diverse, less stratified than previous generations. We have a long way to go. There's no question about it. You know, and sometimes people think that, you know, all social justice stuff is something coming from an elite group of whites. But when we connect to the real people and interact with the real people that we're concerned about, it's easier to bring them on board. But Doug, I wouldn't give up on that. I think there is some positive effort going on. Keep working on those high schools. That's the age group that is going to help us really diversify.
Well, thank you, Bishop Stowe, for all of your words.
Thank you.
I would like to tell everyone who is sitting here in our room that there is a copy of for each one of you, maybe more than one copy of the Advent booklet that we've put out. It's it's taken from our 50 years of Advent booklets. So it's just a reflections for Advent and Christmas that you can, take with you. You can read. There's
Take one to a friend.
Yeah, take one to a friend. That'd be good. And if you need anything as far as learning about Pax Christi Illinois or Pax Christi USA, we have a Facebook page. So you can just look up Pax Christi Illinois or Pax Christi USA, Illinois, and you will find us on Facebook. And my information is nletter, OETTER @comcast.net. Right, thank you. You can put that, Johnny put it in the box for the folks on Zoom, and you can contact me that way, and I will get back to you. No, he's putting up my information.
Yeah, you just put up more info.
He just put up more info. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think Johnny, and there's the Pax Christi USA info if you would like that. I think we're ready for our closing song.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and cue that up, and it's just going to take me just a second here, Nancy.
Okay, thanks.
Awake from your slumber, arise from your sleep. A new day is dawning for all those who weep. The people in darkness have seen a great light. The Lord of our longing has conquered the night.
Let us build a city of God. May our tears be turned into dancing. For the Lord, our light and our love, has turned the night into
We are sons of the morning, we are daughters of day. The one who has loved us has brightened our way.
Let us build a city of God. May our tears be turned into dancing. For the Lord, our light and our love, has turned the night into day. God is light. In Him there is no darkness. Let us walk in His light, His children one and all.
Oh, comfort my people, make gentle your words, proclaim to my city the day of her birth.
Let us build a city of song. May our tears are turned into dancing. The Lord, our light and our love, has turned the night into
Thank you. Thank you again, Bishop Stowe. Thank you. And thank you, Johnny, for all your help with the technology. And thanks to all who signed in. And this ends our program, so we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Pax Christi, Illinois.
Okay, thank you, sir.